Welcome, everyone. First of all, I'd like to see if this mic works. Or would you prefer the other mic? It's okay in the back? Okay. So my task today is to talk to one theme mainly, and that's the theme of internationalizing, further internationalizing ISSOTL and scholarship of teaching and learning as a movement. And I guess the reason I was selected for that is quite obvious. I come from an American accredited university in Europe, which has a history of engagement with Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And I'm originally Polish. I obviously live in Hungary. So internationalization has been a central theme of my life. And scholarship of teaching and learning has been something that I've dedicated the past few years to developing by running an international program for scholars from Eastern Europe. So I decided to put the little picture of a plane there because I was trying to think about how can SOTL travel further afield. And I was actually inspired about this topic by Mary Huber's essay, which appeared in the International Journal of Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, which was called Teaching Travels, Reflections on the Social Life of Classroom Inquiry and Innovation. So this was my starting inspiration for this talk. And the key words for this initially were travel, obviously, but that's just a metaphor. We have to go a little bit beyond that. But I think it's a good starting metaphor when we think about internationalizing. We actually are having to do quite a lot of travel with this kind of work. And the travel of ideas and concepts is what we're concerned with rather than just travel of people. So I'd like to, I will say a few more words about myself and about my background, my program, my whole story, why I'm here in a moment. But as a brief introduction to the talk, I just wanted to say that it's going to concern, in particular, language and the conceptual spread of SOTL or not. And the issue that I hope links what I have to say is identity. Academic identity of SOTL practitioner is actually one of the writing groups that I participated in, the collaborative writing group before. So I have been immensely influenced by this work, even though I prepared, this talk before I came here. But this identity theme is actually also something that's central to my research, which is on internationalization of academic identities and practices. And it's clearly central to running an international SOTL program. Okay. Right. Okay. Now let me get myself together here a bit. Right. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that I wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for the scholars who wanted to participate in this program. I mean, my whole role as a leader is essentially because of people who work in Eastern Europe, in former Soviet Union, who wanted to do this research and this work. One of them is actually here in the room, Rima. She's over there. You can wave your hand. If you ever want to talk to a participant and hear the real voice of the program, that's one of them. The smaller woman in the back was actually denied a visa to Canada to come here. So this is another aspect. I thought I was going to talk about this in a metaphorical sense, but it turned out to be a very material experience about the problems of internationalizing SOTL. She's a graduate of my own university. She's Russian, and she's a political scientist dealing with norms in international relations theory. So obviously, a very dangerous scholar to come across the border. God only knows what she would do. But anyway, my scholars have been my inspiration, and so I kind of want to dedicate this talk to them because, they can't all be here for the rather obvious reasons of material and geopolitical difficulties, but particularly material difficulties. So this is something I want to acknowledge, that we're not just talking about abstract things, we're actually talking about quite embodied issues here. Right. So just a few words about the program that I'm talking about. The program is a developmental SOTL program. It is unfortunately coming to an end this year because our funding has essentially run out. It has run since 2002 to 2012, and I just always used to call it, and I do call it, a boutique program, because in my department this was one of the 2 boutique programs we had, which means we only took 5 scholars from all kinds of countries on board, and they worked in a group of 10 incoming scholars, young scholars, worked with those who were finishing their projects to co-design their research together. I was one of the facilitators, and the other one was someone many of you know, is Dr. Richard Gale, who's the director of Mount Royal Institute for Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, who has been the supporter of this program since the beginning, and one of the co-facilitators. So he was the one doing the work of coming on the plane every year and actually facilitating the workshop with me. I said a couple of words about my university, Central European University, which is a graduate school. It's both American and European. We have accreditation from Hungary and in the US by Middle States. We are, as I said already, postgraduate only, social science and humanities university. The reason we had international programs and a whole department dedicated to that is because one of the mission, or the mission, of our, one of the main facets of the mission of the university was to sort of be a catalyst for transformation of post-communist systems into open societies. So that's the kind of the large-scale idea where this whole work came from, the work I've been doing. Okay. But to give you more of a personal story, how it came to be, this is also important. Betty Higgs wrote an essay about Carnegie Catalyst, the Carnegie program, individual scholars program that was her catalyst for engaging with scholarship of teaching and learning and starting programs in her own institution in Ireland. And I have to tell you about my catalyst. So when I started work in this new department, which was dealing mainly at that time with issues of how to help East European scholars from other universities transform or even construct the curricula in social sciences and humanities, and to access resources and to also construct meaningful courses. As you know, social sciences were somewhat repressed or underrepresented in the previous regime, so we had to do this work of helping people out with accessing resources, and we did quite a lot of course-based development. So my boss, my dean, gave me a book about 6 months into my job. And I was a brand new educational developer. I didn't actually know the term educational development. I knew very well. I knew about teaching methods in the sense of interactive teaching. I had background in teaching English as a foreign language at that time, and I had studied gender studies, which has nothing to do with interactive teaching necessarily. But I thought, from my background, I knew about how to help people teach more interactively. So that was my background. I knew nothing about scholarship of teaching and learning whatsoever at that time, and that was 2003. So my boss gave me a little book, and this book sort of got me going. She basically handed it to me and said, "This looks like an interesting idea. Do you want to do something about it?" And I did. Okay. So I'll just show you a quote from that book. So, and of course, this is from the quite old now, but I find still very powerful course portfolio book that Pat Hutchins edited. And the quote that really was my trigger was this specific quote, because it linked so well to what we were trying to do in our department, working around courses, but what we were missing. And so we were missing this serious engagement with student learning. And it's actually a quote that's still very much alive today, because if you do think of SOTL as more than just reflective practice, for example, if you think of it as a form of research, it gives you a hint as to the complexity of designing research methods for a SOTL project. It doesn't have to be just about a course portfolio as a format. because you have to account for the design of teaching and for its enactment, so for the practices of teaching, for what you actually did in your classroom, and then most importantly for the analysis of student learning. So I was really taken by the book, and I put together a pilot course portfolio project, which we used our grantees in one of our existing course portfolio development. It was called Course Portfolio Development Program. And we asked them if they would like an extension of the grant and to try to write and do course portfolios with us. And after that, it led to me thinking about starting a SOTL program on its own. But I think the role of the community, of this community, was very important to me, because with this brand new idea, brand new project, with its first year of results, I went to the then what we called London SOTL conference. We had a London SOTL conference. It was 2005, and I sat in a plenary just like this one. It was probably the opening plenary, but I don't remember. It must have been. And I happened to sit next to Pat Hutchings. And of course, as we do in educational development and SOTL conferences, we have these engagement activities and buzz groups. My husband thinks that doesn't happen in any other discipline, only in education. So as I happened to talk to her, I presented to her this idea that I came up with and that I was running this program, and she was quite supportive of it. And in short, that led to me basically inviting myself over to Carnegie Foundation, and I was accepted. So I went over there and I had a short residency there. That is how I met Dr. Richard Gale, who then decided to come on board with this project. And that is how the whole program started. So by saying that, I just want to stress that this is an extraordinarily welcoming community that you've just entered. So ever since then, I've been coming to the ISSOTL conferences, well, since 2006, except for the Sydney one. So that's the story. But now for the for the more conceptual part of the talk. And in putting this together, I was inspired by extraordinarily recent, very recent special issue of the Journal for Academic Development, International Journal for Academic Development, the IJAD, which talks about the political geography of academic development. And of course, I've used it only by analogy here. So I want to move from thinking about just the program and the practicalities of the program to what this really means to internationalize SOTL. And of course, this is also following directly in my head from that idea of the SOTL Travels, of Mary Huber's idea of how does SOTL travel to new contexts and across borders. But I thought we missed at that point, or I missed at that point, the geopolitical analysis of this. Or political geography analysis of this. So we have a very rich tradition from Becker and Trowler talking about academic tribes and territories. We have these anthropological terms which also have to do with travel and movement. And I thought this issue deals with a very interesting aspect of it. It basically deals with this idea of using post-colonial theory and using these other metaphors, such as metaphors of migration, and also the metaphors of liminality, of being in between, which really is what SOTL is about. It is the state of, I suppose, moving into a new area, and there are a lot of conflicts, and there are a lot of borders to be crossed, and a lot of identity work that goes into that. So my questions to myself, and I suppose those could be questions for you, for you to think about this throughout the conference, is about the journey of SOTL in how you see yourself in it, okay? Where has SOTL traveled from, and where are its homeland? Borders, territories, visa regimes, neutral countries. There was also a concept of middle powers, I think, or middle states, middle powers, I guess. That's a IR concept. So these geopolitical concepts allow us to sort of be a bit more critical of what SOTL is and where this is going. Of course, it links us to the debate of what SOTL is, what do we want to travel, what do we want to move across borders, if we do want to move it across borders, or what do we carry across borders. What is our language? And here, my first MA in linguistics, sort of my social linguistics background, long forgotten almost, sort of came to my mind, and I decided that also, could we think we have already a SOTL language, or do we have just a SOTL pidgin? And by pidgin, I don't mean the bird, for those of you who are not linguists, but I suppose, are there any linguists here? Anybody knows the difference between pidgin and Creole? Anybody wants to shout it out?
Creole is a better developed hybrid, isn't it?
When it becomes a first language.
If you, sorry, I couldn't hear.
I said a Creole is a pidgin when it becomes the first language of the new generation.
Exactly. So a pidgin is that very narrow, very, let's say, primitive form of language that's used for trade between people that don't know each other yet. And oftentimes the colonial nations were the givers of the main part of that language: French, Spanish, English, Portuguese. And the way I remembered it from my undergraduate social linguistics course is when mothers start to teach the language to their children, then we have Creole. It becomes a language. So this is something for us to think about. What do we have? Do we have a language? Do we have a pidgin? And I also can't help but mention, when I wrote it, I actually did misspell pidgin. English is not my native language, and I did actually write the bird, which led me to all kinds of associations with that episode of Fawlty Towers, Basil the Rat. I don't know if any of you know that, but if you don't know, you have to go and look it up, because it's still hilarious after all these years. Basil the Rat episode of Fawlty Towers. There was a bit of a confusion there with languages and what pidgin and pidgin. Okay, and also talking about ourselves and our identities. Who are we? Who are we? Where are we traveling from? Where are we traveling to? Who do we want to be? Are we international consultants, disciplinary migrants, pedagogical tourists, educational experts, mentors, or brokers? Using Mary Huber's concept of the trading. SOTL is a trading zone. That's another anthropological concept, of course. So I've been called a leader. I always felt of myself as just a facilitator of a program, and the people on the program always looked at me as some kind of an expert. But that's mainly because I had access to these resources and knowledge that I was sort of a conduit for. So I certainly had not done SOTL scholarship myself at that point, and I only started a project last year, so I'm a brand new SOTL scholar. I'm quite an experienced leader now of a small program, but that's a different role as well. So on that point of language, when I was preparing this talk, I decided to go to my friends and my collaborators for advice, and one of them happened to be one of last year's keynotes, Torgny Roxa from Lund. He was a co-keynote with Sherry Lincoln in a very related keynote last year, which was called Theorizing the Teaching Commons. And I asked him for advice. What should I do to make this a successful keynote? And he wrote to me, remember that you should have a one-sentence message. It should come up towards the start of the presentation. And he wrote to me, one sentence only, full stop. Really, full stop. I'm serious, full stop. One, full stop. Sentence, full stop. So after that advice, here is my one sentence to you, in case you were wondering where it is. Okay. So we need to develop our linguistic and conceptual toolkit beyond aspirational concepts of SOTL to construct a shared language. We have an international society, and we also have some amazing concepts, in particular normative concepts. I think we should celebrate them, and we have to believe in them. And what I mean by normative concepts is that people who do SOTL don't do it because just because there's evidence of impact, or just because somebody's measured that, oh yes, students' learning really does improve if you do this one case study. That is not quite how it happens. People do it because they get passionate about doing this work, and I think we should divide the normative concepts from the evidence stuff in some cases. So we don't, for example, say that I go to class on time just because there are studies of impact of what would happen if I didn't. We probably go to class on time because we believe that it's a good thing to do. And SOTL oftentimes, I think recently, is kind of is challenged that it can't produce enough evidence that this really works and improves student learning. And I think that's an important argument, but you can't put it in one sentence as saying, you know, people should care about it, but as long as it produces impact. So on the normative concepts, we have, what do we have? Well, I guess we have Boyer's original notion of the 4 scholarships and scholarship of teaching and learning being, scholarship of teaching at the time being one of those. That's an aspirational concept. That's something we can aspire to, having that kind of academic life, if you will. We have the big tent idea, which is extraordinarily aspirational because that is something that says we should be like that. And I think we have to really celebrate these aspirational concepts, but we need to move beyond them. So aspirational, normative, I mean concepts that have to do with value, with what we value in SOTL, what idea SOTL is based on as a kind of value. Lee Schulman's was and has been a source of this. Teaching as a community property is another one of those concepts to me. But I think we also need, and I think this is a slightly different argument than what has been argued before, we don't so much need to have the same theories or the same methods of inquiry, but we do need generative concepts. And by generative concepts, I mean concepts that will travel across our cases and across our institutions. Concepts that really somebody can do a study around, can hang their work around. And we have some of those already that are unique to SOTL, I think, or unique to those parts of educational research that are integral to SOTL. And I would have to say that, for example, the Indiana University decoding disciplines model is generative. So is, for example, let me think, another example of generative concept would be threshold concepts, for example. So this is the kind of stuff I'm thinking about. I think these concepts are more important, really, than specific theories, because they will allow us to construct a language of this emerging field. We also need descriptive concepts. We need to know how to actually do this work, in particular in new contexts and in international contexts. What are we actually able to package and sort of carry across and trade? So practical concepts also relate to this. How do we do this work? How can we do it internationally? What do we need to do this work well? Okay. So language is my sort of central theme, but by language I mean basically the conceptual stuff. How do we construct it so that we speak the same language and hopefully not a pidgin? Okay. But coming back to the notion of language, we also have a small problem, meaning that, of course, SOTL is not quite widespread as we might want. And I would agree that we have an international society. I think it's a bit of an aspirational concept, that it is international. So it is something that exists particularly in English-speaking countries if we were to really evaluate that. That's anyway how I would look at it. And when I looked at our ISSOTL website, I came across this point. It was a reference to the poverty of existing resources to engage non-English speaking countries, in my understanding. So it says this: Western Kentucky University's Faculty Center for Excellence in Teaching offers a chart of English variations in educational terms, specifically in terms of specifically terms for persons in education, organized groups, learning, measurement and recognition of learning in Australia, Canada, India, Ireland, the United Kingdom and the USA. So there is one thing that connects these countries, and that is, of course, that they're English-speaking. right? So what we need to do is we need to break through this language barrier somehow. And what I did to illustrate it to myself, actually, when I was planning it, I decided to do something I have never thought of doing, even when I was designing the program, and run Scholarship of Teaching and Learning through Google Translator in my own native language. I had never thought of doing that before. My native language is Polish, and here is what came up. Okay, Stypendium nauczania I uczenia się. It basically means something like a stipend or a bursary or a grant about teaching and learning, or to do teaching and learning. Fellowship, but in the sense of oftentimes would be understood as a kind of you were given a bit of money, or your fees were paid, so you could go and do teaching and learning. Of course, it has nothing to do with Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. So then I got very enthusiastic, and I decided to check some other European languages. So here is Swedish. I have no idea if this makes sense, but the Swedish table will nod. Okay. It's exactly the same as in Polish, right? Different languages. Well, Indo-European, but different subfamilies. In Hungarian, I don't know if we have a Hungarian, but I guess I can have a go. It says something like ösztöndíj, a tanítás és tanulás. That's my best Hungarian, which is pretty horrible. But it means pretty much exactly the same thing. Okay? And then I did Russian. Stypendia преподавания и обучения. That is the best I can do in Russian. It means exactly the same thing. It means a bursary or a stipend to do something to do with teaching and learning. And then I actually got a little bit more enthusiastic. I decided, what about a small language? So I tried Maltese, because it's actually based on Arabic, and it's a very small island in Europe. And I had this feeling that it actually is the same thing. It's very strange. So then I decided that why am I so kind of nationalistic? Let's avoid this nationalistic sort of methodological nationalism. So I went for Esperanto. And it kind of comes up as the same thing. And finally I decided I can't be so Eurocentric, and the only language I could think of that I had anything to do during my linguistics and social linguistics classes was Swahili. Or Swahili. Oh, it doesn't come up. And I have a feeling it means the same thing. So this is just an illustration, and it might be more an illustration of the poverty of Google Translator than anything else. Obviously, people in various languages have a way of expressing the term scholarship, and that might not be the first term that comes up on Google Translator. But I do think it illustrates the point that people from non-English speaking countries will not find it very easy to engage with the concept, because they just simply will not understand it. And it does not fit into the local language and the worldview in a sense. It's very difficult. One of my scholars had tried to do work around this essentially in an international university that's located in Lithuania, but is Belarusian. And I think what they were trying to come up with was a term that is called edukologia, which would be something like educology. That is what they were trying to come up with, I guess, to differentiate from pedagogy or... Sorry?
Science.
Science? Sorry? I was talking about how they tried to translate the term. So they came up with something like educology. Okay? And what exists in those countries, of course, are specific definitions of what pedagogy is and pedagogical research. Okay. So it doesn't work very well, and we have to think about it, but not about the language of it necessarily, but about what are we creating, what are we constructing, and how can we explain what this movement is. It's obviously a very, it obviously kind of works, but I'm not surprised now that in the first year of my program we had such a range of applications. I was puzzled because I told people in the call for proposals what this project was about, and I explained. And there were all kinds of things turning up which had nothing to do with teaching and learning, practically. Studying medieval Latin, something of that kind. Nothing to do with a course, not even course redesign, not even anything, not to mention studying or researching what you do. So I think here is a task I'd like to give you to allow you to think through some of these issues, but moving away from language and going into what really subtle means. What does it mean for you? You've traveled far to enter this field, or perhaps you're very near the field. Maybe you're an education developer and a supporter of SOTL scholars like I have been, or maybe you're a new SOTL scholar or a very established SOTL scholar. So I want to give you a test. I don't know if anybody has ever been tested in this conference. So you're going to have a diagnostic essay. Please take out a pen and paper and a piece of, a pen and paper. I wanted to give you a general idea for what I want you to do, but I'm just going to change it slightly. So Mary Huber in her essay quotes McKinney, saying this argument: SOTL represents a new form of knowledge production for academics in disciplines, if I remember correctly. The exact quote is, while still controversial as sine qua non among those who emphasize reflection over classroom research, there's no question that inquiry has opened a new realm of knowledge production to college and university teachers. So SOTL is a realm of knowledge production. I would like you to just come up right now with one argument for whether you agree or disagree with this statement. If you're writing your essay, you basically have to discuss it. So you have to decide you agree with this or you disagree with this, or maybe, if you can't, you're confused. Okay? So take 3 minutes quietly to write down whether you're confused and write your argument for why you're confused. Just one argument. You don't have to do the whole essay plan yet. Or the one argument for why you agree based on your personal journey into SOTL. Okay? And after 3 minutes, I'd like you to discuss this with other people sitting at your table and to just see whether I want to see whether there'll be agreement or not. So just have a very brief discussion whether you agree with this or not. And this is really what we're here to do, is to talk about what this means. So I shut up now. I'll let you think. Come back together as a group, and can I ask the volunteers to help me? I'd like to ask if there is one table where you in principle seem to agree with the statement in majorities. Is there a table that agreed? So your essay plan would have been yes, this is correct or not? Correct? I guess nobody just wants to come forward. This is that stage in the conference. Okay, was there a table that disagreed? Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to come back to the agreed, just in case there are some shy people here. So can we just hear one of the arguments for why you disagreed? And if you could introduce yourself.
Did you mean, did we all unanimously disagree? Because that's not what yes.
Okay, could you give us one of the arguments that were being discussed, for or against?
Sure. So one argument against was that in the field of education, people have been working with teachers on questions of teacher research and teacher action research for a long time, and that has some quite similar characteristics to SOTL. That was just one of the arguments.
Which means that? What does that mean?
Oh, so that would mean that it's not a completely new form of knowledge production for academics, because even if academics in education may not have been doing SOTL themselves, they are able to teach others to engage in similar forms of knowledge production.
So the argument is that, at least in education, this has been a research area in some ways for many, many years. So it's not new to education, definitely. Okay. Could we have, is there an argument for? Not for? Is there an argument for anybody over there? Yes, in the middle? Just share one argument with us, and if you could just give us your name.
Hi, I'm Luella Manning-Kilrankin from McMaster University, and I did say that I agreed with that statement because if knowledge production equates to knowledge generation, then the whole process of engaging in the scholarship of discovery lends itself to that very quote of knowledge production. So that's the reason, from that perspective, I agreed with this statement.
So would you say that SOTL is a form, is a type of scholarship of discovery, potentially?
Yes.
Okay, right. In disciplines other than education as well, presumably.
Absolutely. Like I'm using Boyer's, obviously Boyer's concept of scholarship of discovery, and that engaging in understanding the teaching and learning processes involved in educating students, then indeed you are engaging in the discovery of the impact of your teaching learning processes on the development of students.
Okay, could we have another view? Thank you so much. Could we have another view for or against? Whichever. Actually, I just would like to hear another voice. In the back over there, yes, the lady has been raising her hand.
Hi, Deb Courier from Western Washington University. Our table basically was hung up on the word production and our different connotations of that. We went all the way from assembly line, production of something, and we realized that that was the word after much discussion. Even though we had agree or disagree at the table, we all agreed that that was the sticking point for us, because I'm a theater professor, so production means a play to me. I mean, so we were talking about, and we came up with discovery as well, but that's not the word that's used. So it was the varied interpretations of it that made us disagree.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much. Well, this is interesting because you've been really good students, and you went for the strategy of let's dissect the actual quote before you answer, before you come up with your idea of how do you write that essay. So I never even thought about some of these terms that you as native speakers picked up. I never picked up on the notion of production, and I'd never thought about, new to whom when I was writing it. I mean, it just to me stated that scholarship of teaching and learning is a type of it's a new field that generates knowledge about student learning, primarily in disciplines other than education. And kind of in a way, if I had to hold my hands up, though I come from education, I have a PhD in education, but I do believe that potentially it's a very young field. But what is the most fascinating about the field, to me, is that it potentially is a way of, scholars in other disciplines inquiring into issues of teaching and learning. And the inquiry at one point actually does become research. So I have no qualms about it, that I see it as an emerging field of research, and I am in agreement with Brian Coppola, who writes about that in an essay in the recent International Journal of Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. But I do know, and you will move forward in this conference, you will have to live with this complexity, that there isn't a single SOTL identity, there isn't a single answer to that question, and absolutely for many people this is a form of research in education, and to others it's a form of professional development of teaching. To some others it's just about essentially your reflective practice. So there is not one definition, which in a way makes it difficult to think about how do we internationalize it, because what do we mean by it? It's always the question that comes up. But I think to some extent we have to be open to this idea that we will not agree on that here. Okay, so now just a tiny little bit about ideas of internationalization, which I'm going to skip some of them, but I'll tell you a little bit. So when we think about other systems and going to other systems, we obviously have to engage a little bit with the idea of doing comparative research and understanding that different systems of education, this is an example of different ones that exist in Europe, that they really have also different values. Some of them go to, the Germanic system goes to Humboldt, and that actually has a notion of scholarship, very strong in it. and they're specific using the term scholarship. But they have different systems, have very different values and different accommodations. And the most important thing, the most difficult thing for me is that these systems are varied in terms of how much pedagogical autonomy they allow teachers. And that is a problem, because we need resources to internationalize this work, and we need venues to which people from outside can actually access, like this society. And we need material resources for them to access. But they also need to have a capacity for pedagogical innovation and pedagogical change, which means they need to be autonomous. And a lot of people in systems, even in Europe, are not really autonomous. They're often told things like, in this university, 30% of the final exam, or 30% of the grade has to be a midterm exam, it has to be a written exam. Or you can only give 10% for students' written assignments, but 50% is the final exam, and that has to be whatever format. So in that case, doing an inquiry into teaching and learning is really difficult, and that's one thing I found in my program, that is a real sticking point. And it's worse if the system that people come from is the chair system, which is very hierarchical, where the full professor is the guarantor of a course, so he runs the course, and the young scholars, the young professors actually deliver the seminars, and they have almost no capacity to change any single aspect of the course. I know this is talking about a completely different aspect, but this pedagogical autonomy is something that I've really struggled with, knowing how to help people design meaningful inquiry when they can't do that. So we need that. We need pedagogical competence as well, because until people have a certain amount of, let's say, exposure to educational theory and so on and so forth, that, educational development is important. Without that, of course, we can't have a meaningful inquiry, because people just have no language with which to address teaching and learning if they are not from education. So that is important. Okay. And about internationalization itself, I just wanted to mention there are very different definitions of internationalization. They mean a lot of different things, and there's a lot of policy writing around it. The one I particularly like, and I have built some of my research around, is that it is a matter of changing identities of scholars by virtue of scholars adopting elements of another system, another culture into their identity. And Terry Kim is a researcher who writes about this. Actually, her research was parallel to my PhD. We kind of talked about similar things, but very different contexts. So she was dealing with British academics who are foreign-born, and she was researching that. And her notion of that was that they actually developed transnational knowledge capital, and these were some of the characteristics. So this is a question of identity also, to become international, to learn to deal with otherness and to have a cosmopolitan orientation, and that it's a positional identity. It's always in between. It's always conflictual, potentially. This was essentially the same thing as I came up with my own research on internationalization, which I don't want to go into, but that is what I was interested in. How is internationalization embedded in academic identities? The only reason this matters is because we could ask similar questions about SOTL. How is SOTL embedded in academic identities? Okay. And does it form a new identity or a hybrid or multiple identities? This is what we need to struggle with. In my research, one of the findings was that depending on the narratives people tell about their lives as academics, some of them really thought of, you could say that there were partial narratives of partial internationalization. They were just exposed, but it didn't change very much, or actually was very problematic for them, because they suddenly had this huge competition out there that they were against, this international level that they couldn't access. They were not on the international level in their own understanding. There were people who were talking about significant internationalization, and that meant that basically they've taken quite explicit parts of international sort of values they've derived from another system, from an exposure to another system, into their practices. Such as, for example, they really attributed an element of one of their teaching practices to something they have experienced elsewhere, and they took that on board. But not all of their practices, and they were still national-based academics. And there were these people who looked at themselves, and this is my term, profoundly internationalized, who basically thought of themselves as having double identities, that they were a Russian scholar and an American scholar, and that meant that they actually oftentimes wanted to research in both languages. They were also thinking about what they should live, in Russia, or they should live in the US or France or Germany. So this was kind of interesting, because I think there is an analogy here that people who engage with SOTL, there are multiple ways to engage with SOTL, and the change of identity comes on multiple levels. Okay. And I did some other research with Torgny Roxa, which talks about how is internationalization spreading across the institution. And we basically found it's not spreading. The practices of internationalization are not spreading very easily at all. So it's interesting, really. It's a different form. But this is, I'm going to skip that. Okay. So I'd like to invite you to think a little bit. We are almost towards the end. I know we started late. But a couple of minutes just to think. And then maybe you can drop me an email. There is an email there, sotl@cu.hu, about what programs and projects have you come across that have successfully been engaging people from other areas, and particularly non-English speaking areas, into SOTL work. What have you seen around your institutions? So this is a kind of a question for later, because I'd like to hear and to be able to, in some way, to report on what is actually going on. My one little program is obviously not enough, not enough evidence to talk about internationalization of SOTL in other contexts. So this is a very simple question. What have you come across that might actually work and help to move this work forward? I'm not going to ask you now, but in the question time, you can offer that, or you can offer it by email to me. Well, these are some of my practical concepts, just a list that I came up with. What would we need to spread this work further? We need developmental SOTL programs for people who are new to the discipline and who do not have such programs in their own home country. We obviously need more research on international dimensions of SOTL or academic work in general. We need all kinds of ideas for places where people can learn and meet, institutes and so on, summer schools. We need conference funding for people who find it hard to come to these conferences. And for Eastern Europeans, this is extraordinarily expensive conference. So that's like several months of somebody's salary, literally. So we need to think about that. Is there funding that could actually be dedicated to help people access these very important venues where they can meet and be included in this community and learn? And I've heard of other formats, twinning of education development centers, various online platforms. We need international mentors, though, who will travel to other places, and this is kind of obvious. We also need more openness from discipline-based publishers, both for international voices and for SOTL as such. And we are going to have a new journal, so I hope that one is actually fulfilling one of these points. Okay, so to leave you with this would be my kind of very practical, if I put a policy hat on, this is what we need to internationalize SOTL. We need conceptual and material resources on the sort of supply side, means, in the centers of SOTL work. And we need a strong community networks and venues, physical venues, as well as online venues. But we also need, in each new system, a certain capacity for people to reach pedagogical competence at which level they can actually inquire into student learning. And we need pedagogical autonomy. So that would be my sort of, my kind of answer to the question of what would we need. And questions and comments?
Crux of the problem is I don't know how you feel about it, but do you think that that point about working with discipline-specific societies isn't really the key to get societies on board? Because for my society, we're very international, but we're not focused on SOTL. But if they were more enlightened about SOTL, that would be the way to get it in people's vocabulary.
Yes, I think that based on my own approach to SOTL, which I do believe is an emerging field of research in the disciplines, it's something else for education. But for non-education disciplines, the value in the disciplinary societies and disciplinary journals is extraordinary, and that is where that's a big boundary in some disciplines, not in others, not in geography. There are quite a few forward-looking disciplines that have breached that gap. But for example, when I look at let's say politics, it's not great. That I'm familiar with. History is doing really well, and there have been publications about the role of disciplines already. So I just think that we need to realize that this is something that we are working on, and we have to continue to do more on it. I don't have an answer as to how to do it, but I think it would have to take really big publishing houses also to accept publications based on SOTL research. And that's also part of that. And of course, for that, we need to have a certain quality of research presented. And it's a developmental journey because, it takes 7 years to write a PhD, and it's not going to take 1 year to write a good SOTL paper. Certainly for my scholars, it takes about 2 years to really write a single paper. So this is the same as in any other discipline. This is not going to happen overnight. It's a difficult field to enter. But yeah, absolutely. Disciplines are key. Purple, lady in purple. I can barely see people over there. It's such a big room.
Carmen Werder, Western Washington University. I really appreciate your focusing us on language and the way that we talk about the work. And I particularly liked the fact that you took us back to the language of the course portfolio, design, enactment, results, or analysis. Because I think that language it opens up the work in a way. I mean, I still use it a lot, just those 3 terms. And I think we need that kind of shared language. So I'm glad that you reminded us of that.
Thank you. Well, that's what I was trying to get at with this notion of generative concepts, which takes us away from debates about the method and the right theory, because I don't think we need to have one and the same theory. But we need to account for how we teach and how we analyze the results of it, whatever that analysis means in your field. Oh yeah, I almost couldn't see over there. Yes, the gentleman in the back. Thank you for waving.
I guess I'm a bit lucky that I happen to be members of on the editorial board of 2 journals which belong to 2 fairly reputed societies, the American Physiological Society and the International Union of Biochemists. And they both have journals. One is called Advances in Physiology Education, the other is called BAMBED. And they have been publishing articles on teaching and learning in an international setting for a long time. And these are not half bad societies, actually, because at least they won a dozen Nobel Prizes, so they're serious scientists. And they do take teaching seriously, and they have published lots of articles on teaching and learning in an international setting. So it's not that difficult to cross disciplinary boundaries. Or maybe we're just lucky, I don't know.
Thank you for that. That's very, very hopeful. And I hope there will be more of those kind of hopeful voices and examples of how this has happened. Because it is happening, but I think part of it is not necessarily that it's not possible, but whether people believe this is possible. So a lot of people just simply don't believe this work will be valued, or that they should spend the time on publishing this work because it's not going to be in the top. For some disciplines, it's not going to appear in the top journal at the moment, and that is a concern. And we have to acknowledge that for some people this is a concern, but it is not impossible, I agree. Any comments from this side of the room? Yes, over in the back? Or questions?
Martin Luck from Nottingham, United Kingdom. We have an issue about this in the United Kingdom, which I'm sure colleagues from there will recognise, which is that as subject specialists, it's rather difficult for us to get recognition for research that is outside the specialism in terms of the quality of academic activity as measured by the standard measures that are used to rank universities. And so I think we have an issue in terms of the education of the people that are doing the assessment to realise that this kind of research has an intrinsic value, but also that the people doing this kind of research are subject specialists and not educational specialists. They're not members of education research departments, they're members of subject departments.
Yes, absolutely.
I would like to know how we go about achieving that recognition or suggestions for how we might convince those who do the assessments that this is the case.
Well, I'm not sure that I can convince the assessors at this point, but I think there are two stages of it. The one stage is to just believe and recognize that SOTL is for discipline-based scholars, and it is a process of development. It's like acquiring a new academic identity, a new research field. But Brian Coppola, who wrote that essay I referred to, is a chemist, and he basically says this is an emerging field in chemistry. Some disciplines have been really good at that. Mathematics has had mathematics education as a sub-branch of mathematics. So there are again existing models. SOTL is not the first form of that kind of work necessarily. But I think the first thing is to recognize that this is acquiring a new field. It does not mean that you are necessarily having to leave your existing field. Some people will leave and that will make that decision. Others will not. Some people decide to balance and engage in both forms of scholarship, and that also happens. And it's nothing new because we deal with these multiple identities all the time. What I was trying to point out with this internationalization focus is that internationalized academics constantly juggle these different identities they've derived, and they try to come up with a coherent whole, who they are, where they live, and how can they do the work that they need to do. So it's a choice, it's an individual choice to engage in this kind of research. It takes time to develop. It's like developing a new research field. But you don't have to leave your discipline completely because you, to some extent, use the methods that do derive from your discipline. Okay, in terms of some disciplines, this is easier than others. I mean, for social scientists, it should not be difficult. For humanities people, this is not impossible either. I can't say about all scientists, but there clearly are a lot of science-based SOTL scholars out there. So I would encourage you to just chat throughout the conference to people from other disciplines and figure out what's going on and how do they get this work recognized. I have seen that, in the back.
I have the mic.
You have the mic, thank you. I've been challenged to
Okay.
Left-hand side.
Thank you, Joanna. I want to bring us back to the issue, though, about language and Pidgin versus Creole, because I love that metaphor. But if Creole is when it becomes a first language, then it's what you're primarily using to talk to people within. And if you're thinking more about Pidgin and putting it together in order to trade with other groups who speak other languages, then maybe that's the goal we should have, right? Because we're from different disciplines and we're from different contexts and we're from different countries. So do we want Creole, or are we really aiming at Pidgin?
That's a good point. I think, that it was a metaphor, so I don't think I can empirically think through all the implications right now. But yeah, I think the trading zone, Mary Huber's and Pat Hutchings' ideas about the big tent and the trading zone. Is it a trading zone or is it something else? Yes, I think it is a trading zone. Are about that, are about people meeting and exchanging their ideas. The only difficulty is that, of course, we have to have more and more conceptual complexity of this work to build up. So that is where I was going with this idea that we're developing some kind of a language. But maybe a kind of a lingua franca as a second language rather than a new language. That you don't have to give up your mother tongue to learn a new language and to learn to speak with new language. And every form of science is a kind of language you learn anyway. So this exists as well. Or every form of scholarship or every discipline is a type of language as well. And a way of looking at the world through that language. I think David in the back was waiting for...
This has been really enjoyable, really useful, and I really liked the forum. Posing us a question was wonderful. So I'm going to pose one back. All the discussion so far has been about disciplines. Maybe we're missing the point that maybe that's not what we're like or should be like, because there's another model, which is women's studies, ethnic studies, programs that seem much more like this in many ways, one of which, not just that they're disciplinary, but that they start off with a moral vision and a sense of social responsibility, which most academic disciplines seem to have lost, if they ever had it, along the way. And that from the very beginning, I think probably almost everybody in this room does what they do not as a form of knowledge, but as a form of social change, as a form of moral commitment, in some cases a form of political commitment, defined very broadly. And if we think only in terms of academic disciplines, I think we miss something terribly, terribly important about the very core of what our endeavor is about.
I think this is a very useful point, and I was considering whether I was going to talk about disciplines, interdisciplines, and interdisciplinary fields. So, I mean, in a way, education is also an interdisciplinary field. I mean, it's not just a single discipline. And gender studies is an excellent example of that. So absolutely, we don't necessarily have to be a discipline. I think individual scholars will position themselves differently. Some of them will be in the middle between the disciplines, and some will aim for sort of inculcating SOTL into the heart of their discipline. And I think these are equally valuable positions. As a society and as a community, we are definitely this in between. So we will not form a discipline, but we might form an interdisciplinary field. In fact, I think we are forming it. So this is, and the political commitment, of course, is a huge part of that. And that is what I meant also when I said that we do need to appreciate that we have normative concepts that underlie this work. And I don't think these are just concepts of impact. These are slightly different concepts. These are concepts of what we value in being academics and in being in higher education and what higher education is for. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your contributions as well.